Hi everyone, this slideshow is on accessing academic performance. The first thing that you can do to assess academic performance is to create curriculum-based measurements, or CBMs. They can be used to develop goals, benchmarks, short-term objectives, or for individualized education programs. They can monitor student progress in basic academic skills such as reading, writing, spelling, and math, and they can help teachers make meaningful decisions about the overall effectiveness of instructions. The good thing about curriculum-based measurements is that they're consistent, so they make great assessments that you can use for a pre-test, for testing during instruction, and then as a great post-test too, to make effective decisions for follow-up goals. Another assessment that can be used is discrete trial training. This is something I use in my classroom quite frequently, and daily actually. So this is a method of teaching and chaining steps. It contains 3 distinct parts. For the first part, it's the trainer's presentation, point to the red block. That's an example. The second one is the child's response, which would be the child pointing. And then the third one is the consequence. So that's either a correction or positive reinforcement. And it's important to pause between trials. That can provide an opportunity for data collection. So if every single day you measure the exact same skill, you can measure what parts of the skill are developing, what parts of the skill are mastered, and what parts still need prompting. Barriers for testing success and autism spectrum disorder. The first one is language deficits. Some individuals on the autism spectrum may display delayed speech and language skills. Verbal language proficiency and pragmatic language difficulty should be taken into consideration. In some cases, nonverbal measures that have a reduced verbal language demand may be appropriate. Another barrier is joint attention deficits. So individuals with autism spectrum disorder often have a delayed joint attention, and therefore this may impact their own performance. So if they cannot attend to the exact same task as the test administrator, then they're going to have difficulty performing their best performance of their skills. Another thing is behavioral difficulties. This may happen if tasks are difficult, or if they cause stress or anxiety. A child that struggles to follow verbal directions or engages in stereotyped or repetitive behaviors may also have a hard time participating in the standardized testing, and they'll be more likely to engage in off-task behaviors during the assessments. Another barrier would be sustained attention. So individuals with autism spectrum disorder are more likely to struggle with maintaining their attention during activities that are not of interest to them, and that can also impact their performance that have a time limit. Some possible accommodations that you can consider for working with students with autism spectrum disorder to overcome the barriers is to question what kind of reinforcement is provided. So you want to know what motivates the child, what interests the student that might be used as a form of reinforcement. So if they like some sort of treat or some sort of activity, can that be done as a reinforcement for participating in the assessment? Another accommodation can be used is extended time to complete the assignment or the test. So how much time does the student typically require to complete the assignment or the test? For example, if you're using discrete trial training, maybe you know that this particular student needs an extended amount of time to get through the first 3 steps. So you want to make sure that you're providing an excess amount of time so that they can do that without feeling rushed or an increase of anxiety. You want to make sure that you have a set routine. So does the student require a visual schedule? If so, that can easily be something that you can do to support the student. Do they need prior notice of any changes in their schedule? Does the student require transitions between classrooms or before or after the students? Those are all things that, all strategies that you can use to make sure that the student is successful in their assessment. Is just to make sure that they have as much control over their routine as possible, and as much notice of changes and as much description as possible. Another accommodation is that you can vary the activities. So this emphasizes varied teaching approaches such as visual, auditory, and multisensory. And perhaps if you're doing like a CBM or a consistent assessment that really can't be much accommodation can be made for the mode of instruction, can you piggyback it with something that is a different task? So if something concrete is really difficult for the child, can you then piggyback it with something that is a visual activity or a listening activity or some sort of movement activity, whatever they do well with. So does the student need other types of visual supports, such as graphic organizers or an outline to the content, or whatever it is that you're working on, because that's something that can be definitely used to provide, and it would be a successful accommodation to make. And then another accommodation you can do is allow for different ways of responding. So do they absolutely need to respond verbally in order for you to measure their skill? Can they point to something? Can they show you their understanding in some sort of way? Perhaps they can draw a response, or they can write the response, whatever it is, so that they can show that they're meeting the objective. It doesn't necessarily have to be the response that's typically supplied, but maybe one, they could even type it or use technology to respond as well. Some more possible accommodations are the physical arrangement of the classroom and preferential seating. So depending on where the student can be successful is where that student should be seated. So where the student sits, is it close to the teacher so that they're readily accessible? We want to limit distractions, both auditory and visual distractions. We want to know who the best classmate for the student to sit next to would be. And we also want to make sure that the area that they're sitting in, they at least have a quiet place so that they can maximize their concentration capabilities. Another accommodation would be to format the materials to make sure that it's changed to meet the student's needs. So that would really be like differentiating the materials. Do they require the materials to be highlighted? Does the student need support with note-taking assistance? Maybe they could use a calculator or computer, larger print, maybe a different color background to the paper or a screen. Or do the tests need to be multiple choice rather than fill in the blank? Those are, again, all accommodations. As long as you're not changing the objective of the assessment, then you can really support them in different ways with these accommodations. Another accommodation would be varying the form of instructional delivery. So does the student require study guides or outline material, or do directions need to be provided in smaller sequential steps rather than a large verbal direction in the prompt in the beginning of the assessment? Some modifications that can be used if we are going to modify the task would be that the materials are adapted, so vocabulary concepts and principles are simplified. Does the student need texts that are simplified in order to comprehend the content? So we would want to make sure that any reading material is definitely on their level. And if that modification needs to be made, then that would be appropriate for that student. We also want to make sure that assignments are changed using the appropriate text. So if it is maybe a 4th grade student reading about frogs, we can give them also a 2nd grade level text with smaller, less complex sentences, less complex vocabulary, and make sure that they're really understanding that material. We can also use testing adaptations, so maybe tests or examinations of reduced length. The amount of choices can be reduced, or they can be reworded in a simpler language. We can reduce the amount of classwork or homework if that seems to be a barrier for them. Or we can also use specialized or alternative curriculum at a lower level. So if the grade level curriculum just isn't something that the student can access, then we really want to use some sort of assessment to find out what their current level is and use materials and curriculum that are definitely aimed toward that student's capability so that they're not facing a lot of frustration. Grading is subject to different standards, so maybe a student needs grades that are pass-fail or based on work completion. And then here are my references. Thank you.